kick off, that'd be great.
Thanks, Alice, and thank you everyone who's joined us today. So today I'm going to talk about recent research that we've been doing under the TGRAINS project. So TGRAINS stands for Transforming and Growing Relationships Within Regional Food Systems for Improved Nutrition and Sustainability. It's a funded project funded by ESRC, NERC, BBSRC, and the Scottish Government, and it falls within the Global Food Security Programme of its 13 funded projects that fall under that umbrella that were funded over a period of 3 different funding calls. So I will give a bit of an introduction to TGRAINS and what it is that we're trying to do in case this is the first time that you've heard about it. And then I will show the different data sets that we've been collecting. I'll talk a bit about some of the data analysis, some of the initial results coming out of that data, and also talk about some of the impact activities that we've been able to initiate. So yeah, as Alice said, any questions that come up, go ahead and pop them into the chat box as you're thinking about them, and hopefully we'll have time to get to them at the end. Okay, so let's see, next slide. So TGRAINS is based on thinking about how to make our regional food systems both environmentally sustainable and healthy. So with respect to environmental sustainability, we know there's a litany of research around the environmental degradation that's linked to high intensity food production systems. And so in that sense that we're looking at regional food production because we believe that regional-based UK food system may be able to provide the healthy and sustainable diets that we are seeking, and that resilience in the system could be achieved by strengthening social capital among food system stakeholders. So this chart here is just showing some research around planetary boundaries that was driven largely out of the Stockholm Resilience Center about 10 to 5 years ago. And what we see is that there are a number of different areas of the planetary boundaries where we are already exceeding the planetary capacity to buffer those changes. And so that's within genetic diversity, within phosphorus and nitrogen flows. And these are all areas very heavily impacted by food production systems. And on the other side, thinking about creating more healthy food systems, what we know here, just here in Wales, is that if nothing changes by 2050, the NHS will spend £465 million every year helping obese people. 60% of adults are overweight or obese, and 88% of people in Wales think that the schools should teach pupils about living a healthy life. And this is partially because we see with among school-aged children increase in obesity levels and also a very low rate of consumption of vegetables. And so what we're looking at is thinking about how a regional-based UK food system could provide healthy and sustainable diets, and that resilience in the system can be achieved by strengthening social capital among food system stakeholders. So it's really about achieving that balance between the two, sustainability and health. And we chose to focus on regional food systems based on this idea around building social capital, and that social capital can become a form of resilience in the system. And the hypothesis is in part that when you build relationships back into that system between the different actors, so consumers and producers, but also between middlemen and producers, middlemen and consumers, what you do is you build value back into that food system. And it's not to say that there aren't values in the food system, but with very long global food supply chains that we see now, it makes it much easier for different actors in that supply chain to not know what's happening at other steps of the supply chain. So what ends up happening is that while you may have certain values that around how you think food should be produced, how you think people should be treated, different labor practices. Because you don't actually come face to face with those different practices, it becomes very easy to make choices that do not align with the values that you have about food production and food systems. So the resilience theme is really important within the Global Food Security Program bundle of projects. It's one of the central themes that runs through all of those research projects. And so within TGRAINS, what we're really thinking about is we focus on resilience primarily with respects to how we can reorientate the UK food system. So that's thinking how we can move away from the long global supply chains to more regionalized short supply chains. So this isn't to say that we think that all food should be that is consumed should come from regional food sources, and it's not about banning long global supply food chains, but it's thinking about how do we get more of a balance within where we source our food from, so that more of that food is sourced from our regional farms. And so we do this by taking a regional approach to food, also by reorganizing and building relationships between actors at a regional scale back into the system, and also by strengthening social capital among the food system stakeholders. So the objectives in the project, we have many objectives. The project is made up of 4 different work packages. And so I'll just go through these objectives quickly to give you an overview of the TGRAINS research project. And then I will be in this talk really focusing on objectives 1 and as well a bit on objective 3. So the first objective is about investigating the impact that directly connecting consumers to producers can have on household food culture. So by household food culture, we're referring to food purchasing, food preparation, and food consumption within the household. The second objective is about taking a novel approach by using social media to analyze consumer and producer networks and identify bridging social capital, which can be critical points for intervention. So with that, one of the work packages is looking at the use of Twitter among both consumers and producers and others within the food supply chain, regional short supply chains, and how they're using information that's shared on Twitter, and how that information is being used to build bridging capital. And so by that, what we mean is if you have a node, which is the center person in your network who is sending out tweets, and they send out tweets to 2 people who are not currently connected within that Twitter network, but by responding to tweets from the original node, they form a connection. And that connection there is what's referred to as bridging capital. So, and that comes about because of certain key actors within the system that you're analyzing. That bridging capital is where you create greater strength within your larger network of actors. And so what we've been doing is we identified approximately 40 key actors that we were interested in watching in terms of their Twitter behavior. And for the last 1.5 years, we've been downloading tweets from those central actors, but then what we also have been doing is downloading tweets up to the 3rd degree. So if that central node sends out a tweet, the people that receive those tweets, we're then watching those people, and then the people that they then tweet to. That becomes the 3rd degree of the tweets that we've been watching. So in the first year alone, we pulled down over 1.5 million tweets. And we're now developing a system for characterizing those users and categorizing them. And then we'll be doing content analysis of those tweets. So that's a massive database there, and we'll be making that database also open source once we set up a class characterization system. The third objective is about developing understandings of how social capital and regional food systems is established both online and offline. So we're studying that online through the Twitter analysis, but also offline through our different farm farm level case studies, which I'll speak more about in the next couple of slides. The fourth objective is to develop a novel nutritionscape model that integrates nutritional information into existing ecosystem models to investigate the environmental impacts of changing regional production to align better with a healthy diet. So that part of the project, what we have is a team of agricultural landscape modelers, and what they've done is they've developed a model that looks at, we have two different case study regions. One is in South Wales and one is in East Anglia. We chose those two different case study regions because they represent what we thought were sort of opposite ends of the spectrums, because in Wales, what you tend to have is much smaller farm holdings with a lot of dairy and cattle and sheep being raised on that land, and some horticulture, whereas in East Anglia it's a much more intensive production landscape with larger farms producing typically a single crop. And also the growing conditions, the climate, the ecological conditions are quite different. So within those two different regions, what we're doing is mapping out the production parameters. So the ecological conditions for growing, soil quality, for example, rainfall, temperature, and then looking at what can you grow on this land, what is favorable for growing in this area, and then looking at what currently is being grown, what is the environmental impact of that. But then the novel part of that work is bringing in the nutritional lens. So it's thinking about nutritionally, how might we maximize nutritional intake from the crops that are grown on this land. So if you're thinking in terms of nutritional quality, what might you grow on this land, and how different would that look from what's currently being grown? What would the environmental impact of that system then be? So then linked to that is objective number 5, which is about developing new interactive visual tools to convey a simple yet effective way the implications of regional agriculture and food choice on health and the environment. So this is kind of similar to a CO2 calculator that you might find on the internet. And the way those work is you go to the website, you punch in a few pieces of information, and then behind the website, it's a lot of algorithms and calculations that are being made. But what you see on the facing page of that website is a calculation of your impact or your impact equivalent on CO2 emissions. And so this is a similar way to create an interface for members of the public to interact actually with the agriculture model. And so it's people, what we plan to use this tool within workshops to promote dialogue among the public around what are their values for a regional food system, how do they prioritize health, how do they prioritize environmental sustainability. Based on that, what would the landscape look like, and would that require modifications then based on what your values might be as a consumer. So it's meant to be a tool to inspire dialogue and create more conversations around the values that we have for our food systems, and making those more explicit and visual as opposed to implicit. And finally, the last objective is to design and develop a protocol digital tool for connecting stakeholders in envisioned regional food systems. And so this is the final protocol digital tool that we would like to have as a legacy of TGRAINS. So like I said, I'm really going to focus much of the presentation around the first objective. This is the work package which I have been responsible for driving forward in the project. And so this is made up of regional case studies with household interviews. So here you see a map of the two different regions where we're focusing. On the left-hand side is South Wales, and that stretches over to the eastern border. And to the west, it includes the Gower and just reaches up to Carmarthenshire. And then on the right-hand side is East Anglia, and it captures a bit of Norwich, and Ipswich as well is in there. So we have these two case study regions, and then we have within each case study region, we have two community supported agriculture schemes that we're following. So in total, that's 4 schemes. And within each of those schemes, we're interviewing 15 households. So that adds up to a total of 60 CSA households. And then we have our control group. And so for each of the regions, we have a control group of 30 households. So that's another total of 60 control group households. So in total, we have 120 households that we're following. Now we're interviewing those households several times over the 2-year span of the research project. With the CSA households, we're interviewing them twice a year. So it's once during the harvest peak period and then once during the hungry gap period. And then this is repeated for 2 years. So that will be 4 interviews total per household. And then with the control group, we're just interviewing them once per year during the harvest peak period. And so that will be 2 interviews over the lifetime of the project. So in all, it actually adds up to quite a lot of household interviews, around 360. The interviews themselves are about 45 to 60 minutes. They're a mix of in-person, online Zoom video, and also over the telephone. And part of that is just about accessibility. We did do some trips to East Anglia, and we interviewed, for example, all of the control participants were interviewed in person. We solicited them from in front of Tesco's. So we stood in front of Tesco's and asked people upon entering or exiting Tesco's if they wouldn't mind doing an interview with us. And some of them happened over the phone. If for example, more recent interviews, people weren't accustomed with using Zoom or were more comfortable to use the phone, then we were interviewing them over the phone. So in addition to the interviews, we're also collecting 3-day online food diaries from every household every time that we interview them. So that means it's a total of 360 household 3-day food diaries. These support the interview data on servings consumed for major food groups. So the fruit and vegetables, dairy, meat, fish, pulses are the different food groups that we asked specifically about in one section of the interviews. They're also used to support nutritional landscape modeling work. So when one of the scenarios that they'll be working on is, so if you maximize nutritional intake, what would it look like? But then looking at what actual nutritional intake is within the regional population, what would the landscape then look like to support that? And finally, it's also about comparing the resilience of a CSA diet versus non-CSA diets. And so this we're measuring with respects to environmental impact and overall nutritional values, which is calculated by protein, calorie, and saturated fat consumption. So the regional case studies, to date, the data that we have managed to collect, so TGRAINS started in April of 2019. So it's been about 1 1/3 years that we've been running now. And so in the summer of 2019, we began the first round of interviews, which is basically our baseline interviews. And we collected 112 interviews. And here you see the breakdown of the interviews that we were able to do. In East Anglia, we had 28 control group and 30 CSA household groups. And in South Wales, we had 30 control groups and 24 CSA household groups. And with all of those, almost all of them, we had 3-day online food diaries that were also filled in. I realized I didn't explain the reason for having these different groups, the CSA group and the control group. So the reason is that what we're interested in looking at are changes in household food behavior as a result of building a relationship between the consumer and the producer. So what happens when consumers actually have a relationship with the person who is growing and providing them with food? How do they then, does that inspire changes in the way they purchase, prepare, and consume their food? Originally from the start, we had planned to have 3 different groups. We had our CSA groups, but we recognized that the CSA group when you join a community-supported agriculture scheme, typically you're already motivated to make a change in your household food culture. And so whether or not you build that relationship, it's likely that you're going to change your household food culture. And with the control group, we have the control group in case there are any large-scale societal changes that impact society beyond just the variables that we're looking at. And so we had originally had a third group, which is our intervention group. And the idea was that that group would be taken from the control group, and we would introduce interventions to that group, which are similar to being part of a CSA. So what that would look like is that this group, we would send them regular emails with information about what's growing in their region at that time of year, what vegetables are growing, what the growing conditions are like, things like that. And then we're also organizing a farm visit so that that group would visit the farm, they would have a tour of the farm, they would hear from the people running the farm a bit about their motivations for the growing conditions and so forth. Now, what happened, of course, is that in that period of time, we had the coronavirus hit in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what we ended up with was a large-scale intervention within our control group. And so the realization that we came to was that we could no longer separate the intervention that was happening as a result of coronavirus from the interventions that we would have been introducing to the group. And so what we've done is gone back to having one group, which is our control group. Now, on the one hand, that's a bit disappointing to lose that opportunity, but on the other hand, it raised a whole new opportunity around being able to look at the impact of coronavirus on household food culture. And so that's this slide here. Because we'd already done our baseline interviews last summer, what that enables us to do with this next round of interviews is look at what changes people have experienced as a result of coronavirus. So what we can do is we can refer back to them in the interview. We say, last time we talked, you said that you were doing your shopping at this place and this place and this place. Has this changed? And then people can understanding that was where they were at last year, they can reflect more accurately on the changes that have happened now as a result of the coronavirus. And so we are in the middle of collecting that data. We've completed the round of data collection from the CSAs. So that was the originally planned interviews for the Hungry Gap, but we're also able to ask questions about the impact of COVID-19. And so we've completed that, and we're now in the middle of the second round of interviews with our control group. And there again, we're able to follow up to find out about different changes that they've had to make as a result of lockdown and the coronavirus. So we're currently running the analyses on both the first round of data that we collected last autumn and summer, and the second round of data that we've collected from the CSA households. And one of the things that we see really emerging is that joining a CSA, it's part of, for some people who join a CSA, it becomes part of their journey towards sustainability. So for whatever reason in their life, something has happened and they start investigating and learning about sustainability and different changes that they can make in their lifestyle practices to live a more sustainable lifestyle. And so joining a CSA becomes part of that journey. So they were already trying to introduce more sustainable changes in their lifestyle before they joined the CSA, and once they join the CSA, that progression continues. For another group of participants, joining the CSA acts as a catalyst for that sustainable, for the changes in their lifestyle behaviors based on sustainable practices. And so joining the CSA through the conversations with the people who manage the CSA, with conversations with other participants in the CSA, they become more aware about sustainability issues, and it triggers a journey towards sustainability. So one of the sort of typical anecdotal responses is around plastic consumption. And for some people, it's upon being a member of a CSA that they realize how much plastics they consume through shopping in the supermarkets. And they feel that being a part of the CSA actually enables them to reduce their plastic consumption. And then that triggers them to look for other areas of their life where they can reduce their plastic consumption. And so for some members, it means also increasing the amount of their shopping that they do in zero waste shops that have been popping up. So this comes back to sort of the title of the presentation, which is about the chicken and the egg. So, you know, we always talk about what comes first, the chicken or the egg, but in this case, it's really both. It acts in both ways to both help support people who are on a journey towards sustainability and looking to make changes to their lifestyle, but it can also help kickstart people on such a path. So just to present some of the interview data analysis. So some of the demographics between our control group and our CSA group, they do correspond to some of the typical findings that you have. Our CSA group is wealthier than our control group. You'll see that in this bottom box down here. Participants equivalize household disposable incomes. And so this has been equivalized based on the number of people living in the household. So it averages out the heads within a household. And what you see for CSA members, 29% were earning between 25,000 and 30,000, and 27% were earning between 35 and 40,000. Whereas with our control group, the larger percentage was 33% earning under 25,000. So the mean income in the UK is £35,300, and the median is £29,400. So for CSA members, the mean is 35,254. So it's almost exactly the mean for the UK. However, the median is at 35,700 instead of 29,000. And for the control group, the mean is 28,000 and the median is 29,000. So this means that the households in the CSA group have a higher income than the national average, and those in the control group have a lower income than the national average. So that is important to think about when looking at motivations behind choices of food purchasing. Also, in terms of the age of our control group versus the CSA, they're quite similar. The control group is a slightly wider spread of participants, and the mean within the control group is almost 53, whereas the mean in the CSA is at almost 47. So there is a slight difference there, but not a large difference. If we look at the gender, about 68% of our CSA participants are female and 32% are male, and compared against the control group, which was 58% female and 42% male. And the control group representation is what you can expect when you're doing a random sample of the population, in the sense that it tends to be women who are more readily agreeable to doing a survey. And in terms of the number of household members, both groups had approximately 10% of their households with one person living alone, and the median number of people in the household was 2, with a mean of 2.76 for both groups. So both groups were quite similar in terms of household size. So that's just to give you a snapshot, an understanding of how our two different groups compared with each other. And so this next slide, it's looking at, so when we did the interviews had a few different sections to them. Both interviews had sections around food purchasing, so where people were buying their food from, which shops, how much of the food was being purchased online versus in person, how much of food was being purchased from short supply chains, so directly from farmers or in farmers markets or in farm shops, for example, and as well how much of the purchasing was of organic foods. And so that was one section. Another section was around food preparation. So that was how much time households were spending on food preparation, how much households were preparing food from scratch versus buying pre-processed foods, and things around eating together as well. And then the food consumption section was around if they were vegetarian, omnivore, or pescatarian, vegan, also how many servings of different major food groups that they're consuming as well. So here is data based on the interviews that we did last summer and in the autumn with the control group and the CSAs. And so it's just some basic data at the moment as we're in the process right now of running these various different analysis and building the picture of what it is that we're seeing coming out of the data. So we see that for both groups, the predominant amount of the grocery shopping is done with large chain supermarkets. So Tesco's, Co-op, Waitrose, Sainsbury's, Asda, Morrison, Iceland, Okada, Marks and Spencer's were all mentioned, and almost everybody is doing some amount of their shopping in these stores. With respect to the budget large chain supermarkets such as Aldi, Lidl, Home Bargains, B&M, again, it's quite similar. The difference between the CSA group and the control group, both are shopping, doing about 50% of them are doing shopping in these shops. So this isn't saying how much of their shopping is done, it's how many of the respondents are doing their shopping in these places. We do have data on how much their shopping is also done, but I haven't reported that here. And then when we start to see some divergence when we start looking at the shorter supply chains for food, and that is the local market, the farm shops, direct from the farm. The CSAs, we see 36% of the respondents are buying their food from these short supply chains, whereas only 10% of our control group is doing so. Similarly with local independent shop, corner shops, so this, again, is about 33% for CSAs and only 9% for the control group. Health food, vegan, and zero waste shop. An even bigger difference there when we see only 1.5% of the control group is shopping in those shops. And then the question about buying organic is often as possible. So the question itself that we asked people was, when it's available, how often do you buy organic food? So, and we gave them a range of options: as often as possible when it's available. And we had about half of the time when it's available, less often when it's available, and not at all. And so buying organic as often as possible, we see that 40% of our CSA group were buying organic food as often as possible when it was available, compared to 12% for our control group. And buying organic rarely or never, almost the opposite. We see that 17% of the CSA rarely bought organic or never did when it was available, whereas 55% of our control group did. So participants who are members of CSAs were reporting buying organic produce more often than the control group. And it tends to point to that joining a CSA is part of a journey towards sustainability. It's anecdotal evidence of a small group of CSA members who've been interviewed over 2 years that they have increased the amount of their purchasing of organic and short supply chains. So what this is that there's a small group that I did a pilot interview study with in 2018. So we've actually now have done 2 years of interview with that group, and the changes that we see from year 1 to year 2 indicate this journey towards sustainability, as I've been referring to. And we see that in the second year after joining a CSA, that they have increased the amount of their purchasing from organic and short supply chains. Both the CSA and the control group participants reported some very similar grocery shopping habits, but the CSA members were more likely to buy from farmers markets or directly from producers. And the two groups differed in that the CSA members tended to also buy from independent shops such as local markets, corner shops, health food, vegan, and zero waste shops. So a bit more depth in terms of why participants buy where they do. Again, both the CSA and the control group participants had reported some very similar reasons guiding their shopping choices. Among both the groups, approximately 50% of the participants had cited convenience as a reason for guiding their shopping choices. Low prices and good value for money was also cited by approximately 30% of the participants in both groups. So even though our CSA group tends to fall in a higher income category, the value of the value for money was still a really important and a similarly important criteria for both groups. But the two groups differed in that approximately 30% of the CSA members gave range of produce and environmental sustainability as reasons for their shopping choices, whereas less than 10% of the control group members did so. And a smaller amount of the CSA members, about 15%, also cited supporting the local economy as a reason for their shopping choices, whereas this was just 3% for the control group. And then of those participants who did not buy from farmers markets or direct from producers, 21% of CSA members and 43% of the control group members cited the lack of a convenient local option. So here, just accessibility becomes, or physical accessibility becomes a barrier. Of those who did buy from farmers markets or direct from producers, supporting the local producers was cited by the CSA members at 40% of the time, and control group members 26% of the time as a reason for doing so. And variety, quality, and the freshness of the produce was also cited by both groups as reasons for why they chose to shop from farmers markets or direct from producers. Health was most often cited a reason to buy organic food. That was 43% of CSA members compared to 21% of the control group. 36% of or more CSA members were motivated to buy organic because they understood it to be better for the environment. So that just gives a little bit of a snapshot into some of the differences between these groups with respect to their purchasing habits. When we then look at so now honing in more on the different case study farms, the CSAs, we noticed it through the interview process, actually, the differential role of communication in fostering sustainability. Because if joining a CSA either promotes those who are on a path towards more sustainable behavior, or it helps trigger that journey towards sustainable behavior, a lot of that is also influenced by the amount of communication and the amount of community building that happens within the CSAs. And this is actually quite variable across CSAs. CSAs don't operate as a one-size-fits-all. There's quite a range of modes for operation within community-supported agriculture. At the very basic of it, what it is an exchange, a direct exchange between a producer and consumer of food for money. But it from there, it can become many, many more different things. And so what we sort of broke down then the differences between our different case study farms. And we had a case study farm in South Wales that we felt sort of represented one end of the communication spectrum. And there you really saw it the impact of that play through a lot of the responses that we got back from the households that we interviewed who were members of those CSAs. So for example, so it's the South Wales case study Farm 2. They only communicated via email with their participants, with the members, and the emails were sent out ahead of the delivery of the vegetable bags to explain what was in the vegetable bag, a bit of information about how the growing conditions were on the farm. And that represented the minimal amount of communication that we found, whereas other farms were really operating in building a community within their CSA membership. And in order to build that community, what they were doing was creating means to encourage communication between members of the CSA. So in the South Wales case study Farm 2, there was no communication between members of the CSA, whereas in each of the other 3 farms, what you had were social media platforms set up to foster communication between members, and there's also face-to-face communication happening between members of the CSA. And so the frequency of communication was also higher within those groups. And you can see a little bit of the transference of that into whether or not participants were aware of the vision of the CSA. For 2 of the farms, the 100% of the participants were aware of the vision of the CSA, whereas that dropped a bit for the East Anglia Farm 4 and further for the South Wales Farm 2. And those were the farms where there was slightly less interaction of participants with each other and with the farm itself. And that you see on the visiting and the volunteering. So 100% of the members of the South of Case Study Farm 1 and Case Study Farm 3 had visited the farm, and also for Case Study Farm 3, 100% of the participants had also volunteered on the farm. Whereas for Case Study Farm 2, there was 0% of the members had visited the farm or volunteered on the farm. And for Case Study 4, it was intermediary, about half of the participants had done so. So we see this sort of transfer into the community building and the intra-member communication, which also is partially driven by the pre-existing friendships that exist. You know, if you find out about something great that you're really pleased about being a part of, you go and you tell your friends about it. And so we see that dynamic happening with some of the CSAs, and as a result, you see about these pre-existing friendships. And then thinking about the membership input into governance, that also varied across farms in terms of how comfortable members felt about giving feedback about what was happening on the farm, and that feedback being taken into consideration in terms of how the farm is managed. And then also about learning and growing, so that being a part of the CSA isn't just about receiving fresh vegetables direct from the farm. It's also about learning how that food is produced and grown. And so you see that varied a fair bit from one farm to the other. So one of the things that we see as a dominant role coming out of the interviews is just the role that communication plays in fostering that journey towards sustainability. And I believe this is my last slide, going through some of the initial data analysis. And this one actually was the hardest one, because like I said, we're in the middle of analyzing this, and ahead of the presentation, of course, I wanted to be able to present some more complex and in-depth analysis on this. But with this particular aspect, we found it was very difficult to try to boil it down to a number or to a series of numbers. And this is about the impact of COVID on sustainability. And so I've put a few numbers here, but there's not a direction of change, because that actually we need to dig deeper into the data. We just have about our CSA households reporting on changes within their household food purchasing. We asked about changes across household food purchasing, household food preparation, and household food consumption. But really the biggest changes were around the household food purchasing. In terms of food preparation, there were smaller changes that we saw, with some households increasing the amount of time they had, and many of the households were changing the way that they planned their menu for the week. But with food consumption, we saw very little changes there in the kinds of foods that were being consumed as a result of the COVID impact. So this slide, I'm just focusing on the purchasing, so for example, 86% of people reported changes in their grocery shopping, and 47% reported changes to their online shopping. 67% reported changes to the amount that they bought from farmers markets or direct from producers, whereas 39% reported changes to organic purchasing. And then an interesting one was that 64% had reported other changes to their food purchasing, which was a lot around purchasing treats for themselves during the lockdown. So that was either alcohol, chocolate, or cakes. And it was described as something to enjoy during this period of lockdown where it was monotony and every night staying in, buying different alcohol. So alcohol, it might have come from a specialty shop. It might have been a brand that not normally available in the grocery store. The additional chocolates and cakes, it became something to look forward to in the monotony of lockdown. But a lot of these, like I said, 86% or 47% reported changes to online shopping. For some, that was an increase, and for others, it was a decrease. And so we really need to parse out that data a bit more. Whether changes made in food purchasing are desirable for the long term. So 35% said no, that they wouldn't want these changes to become long-term changes, whereas 55% saw these changes as opportunities for making a long-term change, and 10% weren't sure about whether or not on the balance they felt like it was a positive or a negative change in their life. And 86% of people had found that some foods were difficult to buy. Again, we need to dig into that to see, because there were a number of respondents who simply said, I just waited until it became available again. Whereas other respondents, because something wasn't available, they went online, they did some research, they found other places to source it. And so whether or not those changes convert into more long-term behavior changes will be of interest with respect to sustainability. But so really what we saw is that changes, they vary quite a lot across the group. And it's not something that we can distill down necessarily to just numbers, but we have talked about that we'd like to look at this and see if there's a way to create an index. So bringing together several of the different data points and combining it into a sustainability index of sorts. But even then, I think it's tricky, and it's really about thinking about the narratives that emerge. And so I have a few quotes that I had pulled out. And these are just from the community-supported agriculture households. So one quote from a person was, her reaction to the lockdown in the beginning. And she said, oh, how am I going to get food? And my first response was Tesco's. And so we definitely see that among some of the households where in this period of lockdown and a bit sense of panic, that they turned to the large retail chains to source their food. Another person said, I don't like shopping at Tesco's. I wish I could rely on the farm only, but with everything that is going on, I feel more limited. And so there, I think people felt like, if I'm only going to go to one shop, do my big shop for the week, I'm going to go to my Tesco's, my Asda, my Morrison, the big shop, because I'm more likely to get everything that I need in the one shop. Another person said, a lot of the shopping habit is really around what is the easiest and safest way to get our supplies, rather than overly thinking about where things are coming from. It is still nice to support local businesses when and where possible, but this is not the time to get overly hung up about it. So that was really interesting, because that was coming from one of our households that has been on this journey towards sustainability, and actually had taken made quite a lot of changes in their household purchasing, preparation, and consumption as well, to become more sustainable. But during this early period of the pandemic, they felt like, I just have to focus on getting food, and I can't get overly hung up on sustainability. And so you could see that as a negative thing for sustainability, but actually when you look at that household's behavior compared to the general population, they were already operating quite far on the sustainability spectrum. So they retracted some, but they were still carrying on quite a lot of sustainable actions. And so here's another quote. He also bought meat from an online butchery. It is a company they have used before. It came about during the real isolation, because his household had had to socially isolate for 2 weeks. The Tesco's click and collect wouldn't give any meat products he wanted, and he went into a bit of a panic. So they used this other one online. They also found one through his brother, who gets it in the Gower. They do a click and collect. As a family, they are doing research to find stuff online and local when possible. They found Forage Farm when the lockdown happened, interested in supporting them when this is all over, keen to think of himself as having his finger on the pulse and becoming more aware of what's available and the different options. Hopefully, because people have found options like that, it will help to support those businesses. So this is the same person who said, you can't be thinking about sustainability in a time like this, just need to secure my food. But nonetheless, he is clearly still thinking about sustainability and trying to do research. But one of the interesting dynamics that happened there with that household was that through this journey, they had really reduced their meat consumption, because they'd been watching documentaries on television, reading up more about the environmental impacts of meat consumption. So they were really reducing the amount of meat they're eating, and the meat they were eating was coming from organic sources. But then the lockdown happened, and they just reverted, and he found an online butcher, and he ordered loads of meat in to fill up his freezer, and that made him feel more secure again. So it's quite an interesting dynamic happening there. So I think we really, to dig into this, we need to be able to do more qualitative analysis with the data, identify the different narratives that we see emerging, and what the resulting impact on sustainability and resilience of our regional food system is as a result of that. So I guess what this is really doing is digging into more the nuances and complexity of the initial data that we've seen emerging from a lot of different places around the changing demand for food. We saw a surge in vegetable box orders from regional farms. I think for many of those, demand increased by about 150% across the UK. Really, we see these dynamics happening. And so what this is, and this data then is really about being able to dig into the nuances of these different dynamics and what it really means for our regional food systems. So we've got a number of different papers in various stages of preparation. We've got a paper looking at lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic with the food researchers in the Sustainable Places Research Institute. A number of us have been working on different aspects of the food system and collecting data from those different niches where we work, and so we're pulling that together into a paper. We'll have a separate paper based just on the COVID-19 impact on sustainability of household food culture. But then we have the original papers that we were planning to do before COVID pandemic ever hit. And that's thinking about the impacts of redefining our relationship to food, and also thinking about the resilience of regional diets, both in terms of environmental and health indicators. And so I think what I'll do is I'll end it there. I was going to talk about impact activity that we had planned, but I've run on for quite some time, and I want to leave at least some time for questions. So I'll stop there, Alice.
Okay, thanks, Angelina. That was really, really interesting. We haven't got any questions on the chat at the moment. I don't know if anyone would like to pose a question to Angelina. You can also use the raise hand function as well, and I can unmute your microphone and you can, oh, okay, here we go. Let's have a, see if this works. We've got a question from Susan.
Might just right. Oh, okay. I wasn't going to go first, but I'm now, so I'll go first. I guess I've got quite a few questions. One of the ones that comes to my mind immediately is your interest, and it was very interesting, the whole project, but your interest in sustainable food, which you variously called regional food systems and sustainability, and in relation to health and the environment. But I didn't really get a sense that I would know, or you would know in the project, what sustainable food systems were, because we didn't really get any sort of detail about what those characteristics might be. And so I thought it would be really useful to hear some sort of elaboration of that, so that we'd know what exactly you're tracking here when you're tracking sustainability. And then I have a second question, and that's about just asking you, why is it that you're pinning conceptually and theoretically, you opened up by talking about resilience and you saw social capital, if I understand you correctly, as a key characteristic of a resilient system. And I'm just wondering what understanding of social capital you're using here, including bridging social capital, and why you think social capital is a critical component of resilience.
Okay. Yeah,
two questions.
Yeah, in the first question, you're spot on, and I was completely aware as I was saying it that I wasn't going into any kind of explanation around it, and that there's a lot to unpack from the statements that I was making, and that is about what is it about a regional food system that would make it sustainable. It's not simply by the fact that it's regional. That doesn't confer sustainability upon it. And so so with our case study farms, all of those are managed organically. So that is one aspect of the sustainability impact with those farms. But I think more largely the dynamic that I'm looking at that, and this is then, it becomes part of the analysis as opposed to the founding principle, and that is that through these regional food systems, it enables the development of a relationship between actors, because there's short supply chains, also geographically. So physically in space, people are able to come together to build these relationships. And so the hypothesis that the research itself is testing is, does building those relationships lead to behavior that is more sustainable within the regional food system? So there's a little bit of the premise in that the farms that we're studying are organic, and the systems that we would be looking towards in terms of the direction of regional food production would be more mixed farming systems. And then that kind of falls into the agricultural modeling section and the work that they're doing in terms of thinking about what kind of configuration of food production in the landscape would create improved environmental impacts. So there's several joined up pieces working here that lead us to what would look like a more sustainable regional food system. And so that is thinking about, from a modeling aspect, what results in environmentally sustainable outcomes, and then that is using the digital tool to enable people to interact with that, to be able to express their preference, like how much sustainability do they prefer per se, and what would that look like, what would that mean, and once they see what that would look like and what would it mean, how desirable is it actually, and just sort of promoting those kinds of conversations, because at the bottom of it is one of the things that I said at the earlier part of the presentation. It's about the values that people have and making those more explicit within the regional food systems, so that the choices people make better reflect the value. I guess it's thinking about that value action gap, and the expression of a value versus the actions based on values. So that's a little bit getting into the sustainability question. And then the second question, remind me again, Susan.
I asked you why it is that you are seeing the presence of social capital, and you also mentioned bridging social capital as critical for a resilient social system. But can I just explain now something else about that? I don't see the link between the focus on social capital and the behavioral focus that you're having in the work that you're doing, particularly now, as you've just mentioned, the value action gap, but you've also mentioned several times around behavioral choices and behavioral changes. So I don't get how it is that that concept of social capital can help you understand that. And I'm wondering what definition of social capital or what understanding of social capital you're drawing down upon here anyway. So it was a question about social capital, its usefulness and its meaning and its understanding.
Yeah, and admittedly, it's not my central part of the work. It's another colleague of mine who is doing more of the work on that. But the idea there is thinking about, so we have these relationships that get built up between individuals, but then how can we look at social media or digital platforms as a means for expanding out those relational impacts and connections across the food system. And so that's then where the bridging social capital comes in, is building those new relationships between actors who were not previously connected, and by connecting them can help to further motivate these sustainable behaviors or actions within the food system.
That's actually not what bridging social capital is.
Okay.
But perhaps that's a debate or discussion for elsewhere, because I think maybe other people might have put their hand up and I didn't really plan to put my hand up first and kind of hog the space. So let's just leave that, maybe come back to it another time. And you said yourself it wasn't something that you were doing in the project. So just let's give somebody else a chance to talk there, Angelina.
Okay, I'm happy for that.
I thought you might be.
Okay, thanks, Susan. I'll just mute you a second, and we do have some other questions, so if you bear with me. Okay, so you've got a question from Nuno, who says, thank you for the talk. I imagine that some families have small children. Do you have any idea how much they are also driving the family decision towards sustainability? For example, did they directly drive the parents to go visit the farms, or did the parents decide to go towards a sustainability route because of their children?
That's a really interesting question, and we haven't specifically looked at it, but I can speak to it anecdotally, and that we do see a little bit of the dynamic of children driving behavior in the household. I had one household, it was really interesting over the different interviews, because so in the first interview I had with the female head of the household, she said that her son had decided to become vegetarian. And so they joined this veg bag scheme, and they're getting the vegetables. And it wasn't until later in the interview it came out where she said actually they were all eating vegetarian in their meal times, because the mom said, I'm only preparing one meal. I'm not preparing multiple meals for everyone, so we're all eating vegetarian. And that she actually found that quite enjoyable. And then in the follow-up interview that I did with that household, she said that she had now gone vegetarian completely in her choices, and that her daughter was very close to becoming vegetarian. And I found it really interesting that this was all driven through the behavior of the son, sort of influencing on his family, and the mom talking to the son and learning more about why he was becoming vegetarian. I think he's now become vegan, and having that open dialogue. And I was impressed by the openness of the mother to really kind of take these things on board, and the willingness to be flexible to meet these increasing demands of her son. She said she drew the line at vegan, that she wasn't going to cook vegan, but that she would cook vegetarian for him. Another household, they talked about how in the school, their children were coming home from school. The school had done a whole lesson plan around carbon impact of their food and the different foods that they're eating and how they impact differently upon climate. And that actually played a lot into the thinking that the parent had around their own purchasing habits. So I think, I talked about different narratives emerging from these different interviews, and that very well could be one of the drivers. Another really important driver, a bit more indirect than what you were referring to, Nuno, is just the impact of having children. We see that when they give birth and start a family, that some of these families have then joined a CSA because they're keen to reduce their exposure to pesticide residues that might be found on vegetables in the shops. So from a health perspective, that's also plays a role.
Okay, thanks, Angelina. That's great. We've also got a question from Mark Wilson, who says, thanks very much, Angelina. Are you looking at any other more spatially dependent environmental impacts from changing production other than CO2, for example, biodiversity or flood prevention? Sorry.
Yeah, I know that they are. Off the top of my head, I can't think of which ones, but I believe it was greenhouse emissions, it was pesticide use and runoff data, because my colleagues are at Rothamsted Research, so they've got quite a lot of data around environmental impacts that they can pull from in terms of the modeling exercise that they're doing. So I know that pesticide runoff, fertilizer runoff, CO2, but I'm not sure what the other ones might have been.
Okay, great. Thank you, Angelina. I haven't got any more questions at the moment, and we have kind of gone over time. So unless anyone else has anything immediately to ask, then I'll probably draw this to a close. As I said at the beginning, it will be available on the Sustainable Places webinar pages within the next day or so, to be able to watch it back. And if you've got any more questions for Angelina, we can share her email address, and you're welcome to contact her in that way. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Angelina. Thank you to everyone else who joined us as well. Okay, and yeah, we'll draw it to a close there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alice. Thank you, everyone.